Again, let me welcome Bill Welsh, who's going to speak with us about Washington's lieutenants. Bill?
Thank you, Bob. It's a pleasure to be with you all tonight, ladies and gentlemen, out in Zoom land. It's good to see some names and some friends out there. Thank you, Bob, for inviting me. Thank you all of you for showing up. I want to start with two really warnings. Number one is, as an old New Jersey politician, I speak very fast, but I also have a lot I want to tell you. So if I'm speaking fast, I simply suggest that you listen fast. But I wanted to start. I always like to start this talk with one question and see just kind of what your knowledge of the generals would be. And I'd ask you if you know whatever your thought is, sing it out. The question is, how many men were appointed as generals by the Continental Congress during the American Revolution? Give me some answers, please.
32.
Okay, keep going.
37.
37. Okay, give me a couple more.
56.
66. Okay. One more, then we'll stop. All right, we'll stop now. The answer is 78. There were 78 men, not 78 exactly. And that's why I like to ask that question, because people tend to guess a very low number.
Thank you.
And your answers were not the least bit untypical for what people have answered. I've gotten answers from 12 to 100, but the answer is 78, and that's not counting brevet generals. This is not a battle history of these generals, nor will I cover militia generals. Of the 78, 29 were either initially appointed or promoted to major general, and 48 served as brigadier general, though 4 of those 48 actually declined their commission. George Washington was a full general. This is his commission from the Library of Congress. He was appointed general and commander-in-chief of the Army of the United States. There were no lieutenant generals in the Continental Army, though at least on 2 occasions, Washington unsuccessfully petitioned Congress for that rank for lieutenant generals. And Charles Lee lobbied on his own behalf for promotion to lieutenant general. Near the end of the war, Nathaniel Greene was nearly promoted to lieutenant general, but that didn't happen. Now, the ascending rank is brigadier general, major general, lieutenant general, and general. So again, there were no lieutenant generals in the Continental Army, but there seems to be some confusion with Washington's own rank and a disagreement over Washington's own rank. A number of people say he was a lieutenant general. A few even say he was senior major general, and both of those things are wrong. A part of the problem with Washington's rank is that he typically wore 3 stars. Later in the war, when the generals started wearing stars, Washington had 3, and that's the current rank of a lieutenant general. So many historians have said that he was a lieutenant general, but look at his commission. It says general and commander-in-chief. And confusion also comes from U.S. Grant's appointment as a lieutenant general in 1864 during the Civil War, with people saying that he was the first.
There, we have no sound, but
I don't know. Bob, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm not sure how they even were able to speak. I'm going to mute all one more time, Bill, and then unmute, okay?
Oh, all right. I'm unmuted.
All right, now you can unmute.
All right.
Sorry.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So people say that Grant was the first lieutenant general since Washington, and that's correct, because during the trouble with France in the late 1790s, Washington was appointed a lieutenant general by John Adams. That was the highest rank then allowed by the Congress. So people are right in saying that Grant was the first lieutenant general since Washington, but Washington was a full general during the Revolutionary War. Here are a couple commissions. Let's try it again. Here are just 2 commissions. This is Benedict Arnold's commission, to give you an idea of what some of them look like. And they use different formats. This was just the generic commission that was used during the Revolution. All of these 78 generals were appointed by the Continental Congress. Militia generals were appointed by the states, and theoretically, Continental generals were appointed from a state in proportion to the number of Continental troops that each state provided. By custom, Each state could only have as many brigadiers as there were units to command, but that didn't always work out that way. Here is the distribution of the 78 generals among the 13 colonies and the foreign generals. Most important in predicting an appointment as a general was the pre-war military or political experience of these men. Fully 66% or 70 of the 78 or 85%, I'm sorry, 66, 85% had some type of pre-war experience. By contrast, only 68% of Union generals had pre-war experience before their commissioning in the Civil War. Additionally, 42, as 54%, had some manner of involvement in pre-war politics, be it local governments, township committees, Committee of Correspondence, Continental Congress. And there certainly is some overlap between these two groups. There's a number of men who had experience in both military and politics before their appointment. It's important to stress that only 2 of the 78 did not have this experience before they became generals. So in other words, 97% came to their generalship with some kind of military or political or both experience. These were the men who made the important decisions for their neighbors. They were the leaders of the revolutionary movement. So it's logical to assume it's this experience plus their insider political connections that were responsible for their appointment as Continental generals. State normally nominated their favorite sons, so it's not surprising that these were the state leaders. And some would actually retire to go into government, and a number were part of the Continental Congress and then later U.S. governments. And you'll notice that every state has a general except Delaware. Sorry, Kim, no Delaware generals. Historian Don Hickenbottom asserts that the generals were quite conservative in both politics and military outlook. If that's true, why did they rise up in revolution? Well, probably there are 78 different answers, but the main ones seem to be hatred of England, love of liberty, and a desire for personal advancement. My good friend Harry Ward says that their experiences took root and seed during the French and Indian War. Let's go back. What was the background of these men? They were 50% were English, and that's no surprise. At the time of their commissioning, their average age was 43, which is the same age Washington was when he was appointed commander-in-chief. The oldest at 69 was Pomeroy of Massachusetts. He declined his commission. The oldest serving generals were Worcester of Connecticut and Fry of Massachusetts, both at age 64. The youngest was Lafayette at 20. All right, let's go this way. This are the professions of these to the best we can determine. The surveyor is not Washington. My favorite particular profession is gentleman. There were 2 who called themselves gentlemen. 22 of these generals had little or no formal education. 15 had a fair education. 17 attended or graduated from college, but the education of 24 is fully a mystery. But the selection as a general brought immediate, widespread respect and instant legitimacy. They considered themselves to be gentlemen whose only honorable recourse to a slight or an affront was resignation or pistols. Although involved in a number of duels, there were, to my knowledge, only 2 duels between generals. John Cadwalader, who declined his commission twice, he shot Thomas Conway in his, quote, lying mouth. Robert Howell and Christopher Gadsden faced each other with pistols, but shot away and shook hands. Charles Lee was slightly wounded in a duel with Colonel John Lawrence. He later turned down a challenge from Anthony Wayne, nearly fought Baron von Steuben. Lord Stirling and Alexander McDougall came close, but never actually faced each other. Lachlan McIntosh, labeled Georgia politician and Declaration of Independence signer Button Gwinnett, quote, a scoundrel and a lying rascal. Gwinnett was killed and McIntosh wounded in the subsequent contest. There's disagreement whether Enoch Poor of New Hampshire died as a result of illness or in a duel. 33 can be said to have served throughout the entire conflict. 15 never got that opportunity, with 9 dying of illness and 6 dying in battle. Excuse me. The 6 heroes were Montgomery, DeKalb, Worcester, Mercer, Nash, and Pulaski. Excuse me. Additionally, there were talented Continental colonels who would likely have made general had they lived, and Daniel Hitchcock of Rhode Island and John Haslett of Delaware are a couple examples. 6 were wounded, 14 captured, 17 resigned or commissioned, and a number of others threatened, and 6 retired. And since there was really no retirement program, I don't think there's really much of a difference between retired versus resigned. It was pretty much whatever the guy said he was doing is what they called it. 12 generals were court-martialed, only 4 were convicted. Lee and Stephen were dismissed from the service. McDougal was acquitted of most specifications, but found guilty of one lesser charge. Arnold was convicted, given a slap on the wrist, and he's the only general who deserted. According to the Masons, 33 generals were members of the order, 15 whose membership is doubtful, 26 with no evidence of affiliation. So clearly the Masons impacted the Army in a fraternal manner, but perhaps short of mitigating brutality and excessive retaliation, determining any such influence in the military sphere is pretty difficult. Heavy drinking was enough of an issue for 9 men, including Sterling, Wayne, and Maxwell. It was noted by contemporaries and by historians. Adam Stephen was ultimately dismissed for drunkenness at the Battle of Germantown, but there's a wonderful, longer backstory with the relationship between Stephen and Washington, stretching from the French and Indian War. These were truly battlefield generals, a remarkable 86% having experienced combat during the Revolution. The remaining 14, a number had battlefield experience during the colonial wars, especially the older New England generals who were appointed early on. But it must be remembered that some of this experience varied from close-up, in which a number of generals lost their lives, to commanding from behind the lines. And some of the experience came before they attained the general rank. 11 foreigners served as Continental generals, although a number of others were born outside the colonies. These 11 were appointed not from a state, but at large. 6 as major generals and 5 as brigadier generals. Mostly were French, with 3 Germans. Most came as a result of negotiations with Ben Franklin and Silas Deane, attempting to obtain professional expertise in artillery and engineering. Foreigners really probably came, some to make their fortune, some to advance their position at home, and a few to serve the cause of independence. With the exception of Armand, the brigadiers were essentially useless or troublemakers. For example, Pulaski demanded rank subordinate only to Washington and Lafayette, and he wanted to report directly to Congress, not to Washington. Only his death at Savannah elevated him into the pantheon of heroes. One contemporary labeled Formay and Wodekai as, quote, worthless drunkards. By the end of the war, only Armand remained. Of the major generals, Lafayette, DeKalb, Steuben, Deportes all made significant contributions to victory. Not so Cordray and Conway. The former was a competent artillery and engineering officer whose appointment nearly led to the resignation of Greene, Sullivan, and Knox. The arrogant Frenchman's early drowning in the Schuylkill solved the problem. Lafayette called it, quote, a fortunate accident. Conway's role in the cabal bearing his name is well known and still debated. Lesser known is the near resignation of 23 more senior brigadiers who Conway was promoted over their heads. Lobbying Congress for promotion seems to be one of the major intramural sports of the foreign officers. The most interesting assessment of the foreign officers came in a letter from Washington to Gouverneur Morris in 1778. Washington said in this confidential letter, in a word, although I think the Baron, Steuben, an excellent officer, I do most devoutly wish that we had not a single foreigner amongst us, except the Marquis de Lafayette, who acts upon very different principles from those which govern the rest. I suspect probably by 1783, Washington had changed some of his views about some of the other generals too. And these were not only the brigade and the division and the theater commanders, they were also Washington's chief advisors. At the time of his appointment as commander-in-chief, Washington was directed by the Continental Congress to use his generals in the Council of War, quote, advising with your Council of War. And there are numerous examples of Washington doing just this during the campaigns of Boston, New York, New Jersey, and Philadelphia. And this led to charges that Washington was too weak, too strongly influenced, by his councils and his generals. Early in the war, more votes were taken at councils, and Washington seemed to be inclined to go along with the vote. As he became more confident in his role, this occurred less often. He would strive for consensus, not necessarily a majority view. He was willing to accept, quote, respectful dissent. And he demonstrated this in a 1778 letter response to a letter to Charles Lee. He told him, quote, I shall be always happy in a free communication of your sentiments upon any important subject relative to the service, and only beg that they may come directly to me. One theory was that Washington would share his view or strategic plan with one of his generals, who would then present that at a council as his own, giving the appearance that the suggestion was coming from the floor. Washington's decisions generally reflected the collective wisdom of his generals as expressed in these councils. But he often had to deal with generals who placed their strategic or tactical views above his own, disregarding or disobeying his orders. In 1776, Washington's entreaty to lead to join his army went on and answered until he was captured. Then Sullivan brought the troops down. On Washington's orders, Gates sent troops south to join the main army, only to have them waylaid by Putnam, who felt his strategic need was greater. Conway refused to obey any order which he did not personally approve. And additionally, Congress assigned generals and moved troops around without advice or approval of Washington. And it's just a sampling of what he had to deal with. Rarely did Washington have what he considered to be a sufficient number of generals, with brigadiers regularly commanding divisions and colonels commanding brigades. In January 1777, he wrote to Congress outlining his plan for army reorganization, recommending one brigadier general for every 3 regiments and 1 major general for every 3 brigades. He actually, in most times, had a major general command only 2 brigades. He never got the 30 brigadier general that he thought were necessary. That's probably an unrealistic request on his part. But nevertheless, Congress did promote 5 men to major general and 11 to brigadier general in February of 1777, the largest such advancement in the war. But Washington never got his 3 or 4 lieutenant generals that he asked for. And there's no doubt that certain men like Greene and Knox had considerable influence over Washington, sometimes not always to the best, as proven at Germantown and Fort Washington. Hugh Rankin points out the interesting irony that Washington eventually constructed a regular army based on the English model, while rejecting the professionals like Lee and Gates and using amateurs. Most of the pre-war experience of his generals had come as low-level company officers. George Billis puts it this way, quote, the ability of American generals to put their peacetime pursuits to good wartime use helps to account in part for the success of the Patriots against British professionals. According to my estimate, at least 65 of these generals had some direct contact with Washington during the war. They can certainly be called Washington's lieutenants. But what did Washington think of these lieutenants? Although they never clashed openly, Washington and Ward did not seem to care for each other that much. Washington considered Wayne daring, a bit rash, though he admired him as a field commander. The commander-in-chief rated McDougal high for sound sense, energy, and military judgment. He considered Heath and Spencer incompetent. He was cordial to and supportive of Schuyler. Early on, Putnam was considered an able general. As the war progressed, this view shifted, with Washington assigning him to mostly backwater commands. He said that he had, with so moderate a sense of ability. Now, Putnam had a stroke in 1779, so that certainly didn't help. Of his artillery commander, Knox, Washington said his genius supplied the deficit of means. Washington considered Lord Stirling to be reliable, courageous, solid, but not brilliant. Greene was supposedly Washington's choice to replace him as commander-in-chief if need be. There has been no documentation to that effect ever discovered. I have some thoughts on that I'd be happy to share with you later. He trusted and resolved the myriad problems of the quartermaster department, and he sent him south to command that theater. To John Sullivan, Washington wrote, quote, no other officer of rank in the whole army has so often conceived himself neglected slighted and ill-treated as you have done, and none, I am sure, has less cause than yourself to entertain such ideas. He felt that Sullivan was, quote, touched with a tincture of vanity and had too great a desire of being popular. But Washington obviously trusted Sullivan, and he turned to him again and again for major commands, admitting he was active, spirited, and zealously attached to the cause. He further wrote, his wants are common to all of us, the wants of experience to move upon a large scale, for the limited and contracted knowledge which any of us have in military matters stands in very little stead. Washington's comments are rather tame compared to the assessment of the generals by the brother officers and other contemporaries. First, the negative. Charles Lee described Artemus Ward as, quote, a fat old gentleman who has been a church warden. Sullivan seemed to be the target of many barbs, such as the one from North Carolina Congressman Thomas Burke, who called him, quote, the marplot of our army, and his miscarriages are, I am persuaded, owing to his total want of military genius. Alexander Hamilton believed that Charles Lee, quote, has a certain preconceived and preposterous notion of being a great man. Hamilton said of Thomas Conway, is one of my favorites, he was one of the vermin bred in the entrails, and does not exist a more villainous calumniator and incendiary. Major William Heath of Morgan's Corps said of William Maxwell, he is to be sure a damned bitch of a general. A British officer described Maxwell's, quote, the most ungentlemanly looking fellow I ever saw. One would take him as an invalid corporal of artillery. Greene described Conway as a worthless soldier. He is, quote, a man of much intrigue and little judgment. Lafayette called Sterling, quote, braver than wise. He said of Maxwell, quote, the senior, but also the most inept brigadier general in the army. The Chevalier de Chateauneuf accused Sterling, quote, of liking the table and bottle, full as much as becomes a lord, but more than becomes a general. He described him as old and rather dull. Gates was, quote, a snob of the first water who never led troops and had no idea what he was doing. Further, Robert Trout, an aide at Saratoga, proclaimed that Gates was, quote, most subject to the fascinating and corrupting influence of flattery than any man I have ever been acquainted with. Congressman Gouverneur Morris said that Lachlan McIntosh was, quote, one who excelled in the regularity of still life from the possession of an indolent uniformity of spirit. Colonel Daniel Brodhead claimed that McIntosh is, quote, unfortunate enough to be universally hated by every man in the department and civil and military. So when you read today's political comments, just keep some of these in mind. It ain't different than it used to be. When Christopher Gadsden left Congress to take command of the troops at Charleston, his colleague, South Carolinian Thomas Lynch, wrote, my colleague Gadsden is going home to command the troops. God save them. Lafayette labeled his fellow Frenchman de Caudray a clever but imprudent man, a good officer but vain to the point of folly. Virginian William Woodford was the target of a barb from an orderly sergeant. Bo Woodford, commander of the Virginia Division, and the damnedest rascal on this earth without exception. And according to Thomas Rodney, General Varnum of Rhode Island has read some little in books, is fond of speaking and spouting out everything that his reading has furnished him, with whether apt or not to the purpose. Samuel Holden Parsons of Connecticut was described as, quote, a plain, mead-looking old man who wore shoes that I fancy made by himself. Strange. In 1777, John Adams reported that Schuyler, Putnam, Spencer, and Heath are thought to be, by very few, to be capable of the great commands that they hold. And these are my two favorites. The first one was from Alexander McDougall, who described Joseph Spencer, George Clinton, and William Heath as, quote, a fool, a knave, and an honest, obstinate man. Congressman Benjamin Rush described part of the high command of the Army thusly: four major generals, Greene, Sullivan, Sterling, and Stephen. The first, Greene, a sycophant to the general, Washington. Timid, speculative, without enterprise. The second, Sullivan, weak, vain, without dignity, fond of scribbling, in the field a madman. The third, Sterling, proud, lazy, vain, ignorant, drunkard. And the last, Stephen, a sordid, bloating, cowardly sot. Benjamin Rush, in my mind, was the number one complainer in the Revolution. I Great John Adams is second, but Rush, I think, was the biggest complainer. But there are certainly many positive views, just the opposite. From Nathaniel Greene, great generals are scarce. There are few Morgans to be found. Subordinate Enoch Anderson thought William Smallwood, quote, a man of excellent understanding. Lafayette credited Baron de Cobb with, quote, more sense than the rest of the officers. He also praised McDougal as, quote, rigid, imperturbable virtue. Greene described Lafayette as one of the sweetest tempered young gentlemen. Major Jeremiah Fogg described General Enoch Poor as the second man in the world, and presumably that's behind Washington. The Frenchman Chatelux described Heath thusly: his countenance is noble and open. He has a great sensibility of mind and a frank and amicable character. And the oft-criticized Sullivan was praised by the competent Greene. He has sensible, active, ambitious, brave, and persevering in his temper. Similarly, Knox said of Greene, he came to us the rawest, the most untutored being, yet in a year was equal to the military acumen to any in the army and very superior to most. And even the hard-to-please Charles Lee, no supporter of Washington, he wrote positively about Knox, Sullivan, Sterling, Schuyler, Wayne, and Greene, believing they were, quote, exceptions to the general character of the army. During a race to the Dan, Greene admonished the colonel for sleeping. The colonel replied, why, General, I knew you were awake. Greene considered that to be the highest compliment he ever received. And one of my favorites comes from the enemy, Lord Cornwallis. Greene is as dangerous as Washington. I never feel secure when encamped in his neighborhood. And one final quote, and I don't know if it's meant as a compliment or a criticism, but probably the latter. A resident of Savannah said of Robert Howe, quote, a sort of woman eater that devours everything in his way and that no woman can withstand. Despite all this vitriol, it seems that Washington and his generals collectively were loyal to one another. Washington usually avoided public criticism of his subordinates, even when they probably deserved it. And with few exceptions, they responded in kind. And certainly one exception was the so-called Conway cabal. And today, while there's dispute over whether it actually existed, it does seem that a group of certain generals and politicians sought to replace Washington. Opinions vary as to whether or not this was organized enough to be a cabal, or it was simply legitimate opposition to a general who was not such a successful commander at that point. But as one historian points out, the key factor in evaluating Washington's response was his belief that it did in fact exist. Another historian pointed out that Washington's most loyal generals were the ones who were no threat to him, but still Washington's lieutenants were essentially loyal subordinates. But loyalty didn't mean that there weren't battles among the generals. Historian Richard Kahn says they were never a unified group. They quarreled like cats and dogs. Dispute over rank and prestige were the most common points of contention, as witnessed by Washington's observation to Congress that, quote, not an hour passes without new applications and complaints about rank. There's one estimate that says fully 10% of Washington's letters during the war had to do with complaints about rank from officers. As examples, the bickering between Gates and Schuyler, Arnold's reaction being passed over for promotion, and a nearly insubordinate response to Conway's promotion. In 1778, Virginians Scott, Wheaton, Woodford, and Muhlenberg engaged in what one historian called the patriotic pastime of battling over rank. And here are the Virginia generals. I use this slide in another talk when I've emphasized what's going on in Virginia. Relations with the Continental Congress were more strained, however. Both sides seemed to view the other with mistrust and even contempt. Washington realized that the generals were necessary, the Congress realized that the generals were necessary, but they didn't trust them. John Adams told Gates, we choose to trust you generals with too much power for too long. We don't choose to trust you generals with too much power for too long of a time. His cousin Sam was more blunt, saying the army had too many, quote, idle, cowardly, or drunken generals. They occasionally refused to allow generals to resign. And I'm going to skip over a couple parts here for time purposes. Generals hated the Congress for its weakness and arrogance, and as well as some considered personal slights or insult. Green wrote, "For my part, I would never give any legislative body an opportunity to humiliate me but once." He called the Congress the talking gentleman. Seems appropriate. Charles Lee considered being ranked behind Artemus Ward as, quote, the highest in dignity. In fairness to Congress, they had a difficult job in appointing generals. John Adams, "Nothing has given us more torment than the scuffle we have in appointing general officers." In theory, the so-called Baltimore Resolution described that selection and promotion was based on some undefined combination of seniority, merit, number of troops provided by states, but also there was political connections, military necessity, favorite sons, jockeying for promotion. The result, according to Dr. Jonathan Rossi, was, quote, "a serious command problems with the Army and bitter battles in Congress." During one impasse, the resolution suggesting that candidates for promotion be referred to the Army for a decision was objected to by John Adams, who was saying, "We were disposed to idolize an image which our own hands have molded," meaning Washington. At one point, Washington complained that, quote, "appointment of major generals seems to be under no fixed government," meaning method. Yet most of the problems occurred early in the war, because by May of 1778, 24 of the 29 major generals had been appointed, and 57 of the brigadier generals by the end of 1778. When the case of officers appointed the same day, seniority was determined by their relative position on the list of names. And I'm going to skip over what historians have to say about these guys. I'll move on to some other thing. But a final comment from one historian I thought was very, very descriptive, perhaps a nice conclusion. Stephen Taffy, in his book on Washington's generals, his recent book, says that the generals showed more courage than skill. I want to share a couple bits of trivia with you about these men, some humorous. Henry Knox lost 2 fingers on his left hand as a result of a youthful hunting accident, and habitually wrapped that hand in a handkerchief to hide the deformity. Knox was one of Washington's largest subordinates, weighing in at 280 pounds in August of 1783. These weights were taken at West Point on a scale when Washington and his staff were visiting the fort at West Point. I get a kick out of the fact that 2 General Huntingtons don't make 1 General Knox. However, apparently the largest officer in the Continental Army was Colonel Israel Shreve of New Jersey, who weighed in at 320 pounds, but not being a general, he's not there. Nathaniel Greene walked with a limp, which prevented him from receiving a commission in his militia company. His troops called him the Crab. He was asthmatic and had a nervous temperament. The journals of the Continental Congress originally listed Artemus Ward as first major general and second in command, but the last 4 words were stricken out. Francis Nash fathered 1 or 2 children by 1 or 2 local barmaids. Daniel Morgan never whipped his troops, probably as a result of his experience during the French and Indian War. One of his toes was bent at a strange angle as a result of kicking an opponent in a brawl. One of Steuben's favorite culinary delights was black snake. Benjamin Lincoln was a narcoleptic, frequently falling asleep during conferences. While in a coma, Mordecai Gist was thought to be dead, but his friend Nathaniel Greene noticed movement in his eyelids. Thus spared from premature burial, Gist recovered and went on to father States and Independence Gist. A descendant was Confederate General States Rights Gist. And likewise, Civil War General Benjamin Huger was a nephew of Revolutionary General Isaac Huger. Songwriter Johnny Mercer was a descendant of Hugh Mercer. John Cadwalader twice declined a Continental Commission to serve in the Pennsylvania militia. Charles Lee insisted upon a congressional pledge indemnifying him for any financial loss that occurred during the war. He named his 3 ever-present dogs the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Schuyler, Arnold, Lee, DeHaas, Steuben, Moultrie, Wayne, and Sterling all suffered from gout. Louis Depotet, the chief engineer, was characterized as cold and distant. He once claimed, quote, "There is 100 times more enthusiasm for the revolution in a single cafe in Paris than all the United Colonies." Alexander McDougall was noted for having little concern for the comfort of his enlisted men. He had a slight speech impediment, as did Israel Putnam, who spoke with a lisp. William Smallwood had a bad temper and was perpetually angry. The Wright brothers named one of their lines of bicycles after Arthur Sinclair. Lord Stirling has both a cigar and a wine brewing or making medal named after him. John Reed of New Hampshire was blind and partially deaf during his 1-month tenure as general. Lafayette was probably the richest of all the generals. He had never seen Indians before, and he referred to some Oneidas as, quote, the scalping gentleman. Anthony Wayne was buried in 2 locations, his flesh in Erie, PA, and his bones in Radnor, PA. In the 1930s, when then actor Marion Morrison was originally renamed Anthony Wayne by his director, the studio objected because of the mad implication and also said that it sounded too Italian. He became John Wayne. George Clinton was governor of New York at the same time he was a general, and 5 former generals were serving in Congress in 1780 and others before and after. The war's end in 1783, Congress directed, quote, that the Secretary of War issued to all officers in the Army under the rank of Major General, who held the same rank now that they held in the year 1777, a brevet commission 1 grade higher than their present rank. 13 brigadiers were breveted as major generals, and 26 colonels were breveted as brigadier generals. And a brevet rank is essentially an honorary rank. It was a big thing in the Civil War and the Frontier Army, and the cause of many problems. 5 more were added later. Prior to this, during the course of war, 3 additional were breveted as brigadier general. That of the scoundrel James Wilkinson causing an uproar when it happened. Nothing was done for the current major generals. Now, finally, here's my list of the most important of Washington's lieutenants. And this is not meant to be the best list. It's determining the best would be really difficult, given different types of assignments and responsibilities. How do you compare a brigade commander with a theater commander, for example? Admittedly, too, we know too little about some of these generals. So my top 10 list of most important, and in no particular order, this is random, reflect those generals that I believe had the most impact on Washington and the war. All right, let's see if we can get this to work. Nathaniel Greene, I have reasons for all these, but I will not go through them. Nathaniel Greene is probably the most important. He just happens to be the first one I listed. Benedict Arnold, Horatio Gates, Marquis de Lafayette, Henry Knox, Frederick von Steuben, Daniel Morgan, John Sullivan, Louis Duportet, the chief engineer, totally overlooked, William Alexander Lord Stirling, and that's kind of as a Jersey boy, that's kind of a personal favorite. Though my friend Bruce Venter has probably convinced me that I should really put in Philip Schuyler, so I'll go along with that. Now I want to give you my vote for the 10 worst. Benedict Arnold, for obvious reasons. I'm sure people will disagree with me on that. I'd be happy to hear your opinions as to the good, the bad, and the ugly. By the end of the war, these men had really become confident, become good leaders. These generals were essentially, they were essentially, I'm trying to think of the right words that I want to use here. They were incompetent in some cases. They were poor leaders, but they were also patriotic. They were dedicated. They were competent. They were really men that we should be admiring. And I want to end by giving you a quick look at as many of these generals as I've been able to determine, and these are in the rank order. Obviously, Washington is first, Artemus Ward, Charles Lee, Philip Schuyler, Israel Putnam, Richard Montgomery, who was killed in Canada, John Thomas, who died in Canada, Horatio Gates, William Heath, Spencer. We talk about Gates being called Granny, and there's not a lot of documentation for that during the Revolution, but there is documentation that Joseph Spencer of Connecticut was called Granny during the Revolution. John Sullivan, Nathaniel Greene, Benedict Arnold, Lord Stirling, one of my personal favorites, Thomas Mifflin, Sinclair. This is probably not Adam Stephen, but somebody put this out on the web and said, this is Adam Stephen. My late friend Harry Ward, who wrote the biography on Stephen, could never find a rendering of Stephen. We don't think that's right, but I'd put it in so somebody doesn't come back and say, oh, here's Adam Stephen. So I don't think that's Stephen. Benjamin Lincoln, Narcoleptic, Lafayette, DeCordray, DeKalb, Robert Howe, the Womanizer, Alexander McDougall, Thomas Conway, von Steuben, Smallwood, smiled a little bit, but generally has a scowl. Samuel Holden Parsons from Connecticut, Henry Knox. Chief engineer, in my mind, very important guy, but totally overlooked during the Revolution. But thanks to Roger, we have a biography of him. William Moultrie, South Carolina, David Wooster, John Armstrong, William Thompson, Andrew Lewis, General Moore, Hugh Mercer, James Reed, Clinton, Gadsden, McIntosh, William Maxwell. Again, there's no picture of Maxwell. This was a rendering done by an artist in Union, New Jersey that supposedly looks like Maxwell based on descriptions, etc. But it's just that it's conjecture. John Cadwallader, who turned down his commission. Enoch Poor is buried up in Bergen County, New Jersey. Glover, the Marblehead Man. Patterson, Anthony Wayne, James Varnum, DeHaas. We don't hear much about him. William Woodford, who died as a prisoner in the hands of the British after the capture of Charleston. Peter Muhlenberg, Whedon, brother of James Clinton. Edward Hand, Charles Scott, Huntington, turned down his commission. Reed, Pulaski. I don't believe that for a moment that he was actually a woman. John Stark, Huget, Gist, William Irvin, Daniel Morgan, Arthur Williams, John Greeton, Rufus Putnam, cousin of Israel Putnam, Elias Staten in New Jersey, Armand, and this is just a fictional representation of Washington with many of his officers. So I thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. And I would be glad to try to answer any questions, but I don't know anything else.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was fascinating and also very humorous at times. I learned a lot.
First chat question from Roger Williams. Who was the minister?
Who was the minister?
Yeah, you said, well, the professions, one was a minister.
Peter Muhlenberg of Virginia.
Yeah.
Peter Muhlenberg of Virginia was the story goes that he's a Lutheran minister in the Shenandoah Valley. And during the revolution, at the beginning of the revolution, he was preaching a time for this and a time for that sermon with his cassock on. And when he said a time for war, he opened up the cassock and had his Continental uniform underneath and went out and recruited, I believe, the 9th Virginia. There's probably some truth to some parts of that story, but the whole thing didn't happen exactly that way, I don't believe. Yes, sorry, Roger, I didn't know what you meant by the minister. Gotcha.
Okay, we have from Robert Wong 3 questions.
Bob.
Which 2 of the 78 generals did not have either prior war experience or politics?
2 from Maryland, Arthur Williams and Mordecai Gist.
Okay, his second question is, which American generals did the French and the British admire the most? They might be more objective and free of intrigue.
Unmute Bob and have him answer that question. Bob knows his stuff. I gave this talk in Morristown many years ago, and I started asking questions, and Bob was the only one who could answer them. So I invited him to come up and take over the podium. So Bob, what's your view on that? I want to hear what you have to say.
Oh, let me unmute him. I'm sorry. Give me a second here. Sorry about that. Participants.
That's
Yeah,
basically because they don't have an answer, Bob. I want to hear what your
Yeah.
answer is.
Well, I mean, I don't have a specific opinion, but the point is that the French joined in 1778, and because they came out from the outside, they didn't have to bother with the intrigue and the backbiting that occurred among the American officers. So they saw what they did in the battlefield, and would have a more objective opinion. So I was just curious if they thought, besides Washington, who they admired the most in terms of overall command, battlefield command, and handling of troops.
Well, I mentioned that Cornwallis had a very positive comment about General Greene, that he's not comfortable when he's in his
Yes.
command, when he's in his area. So I would certainly say, in that sense, that's one. Interesting question, Bob. I'm not sure I could come up with any off the top of my head. I'm sure there are some out there, but I would certainly like to hear what other people have to say about that. So, Joe, however you want to handle that in terms of
Okay,
you know,
let me give you Bob's third question.
sure.
What did Washington think of Rochambeau as a general?
I believe they got along very well. I think Washington probably admired him, and I suspect that Washington has a not as long experience as a professional as Rochambeau was, that he might have been a little intimidated by him. But on the other hand, everything I've read suggests that they had a reasonably good relationship, and when they did get along. And the smart guy doesn't list too many of these things in writing. If he has a negative view of him, he doesn't put it in writing. So I'm not sure I can do better than that with an answer. Plus, I didn't do the French generals.
Okay, one last thing. Roger Williams has another question, but being we're off of mute, maybe Roger, you want to ask Bill the question or direct the way you just wrote in the chat?
Sure. So, Bill, there's a lot given to how Washington picked out young officers, Greene and Knox, very early on to be part of his inner circle. How was he so blind to Arnold's treachery? I mean, what gave him a lot of rope.
He did. He thought very highly of Arnold. I know he wanted him, after his wounding, he wanted him to come back and take over part of the Continental line. I can't remember if it was the left, it would have been the right, the left flank or the reserve. I don't know, Roger. That's an excellent question. He was certainly, based on everything we've read, he was certainly shocked and surprised by Arnold's treachery. Maybe Arnold was that good. Everybody said Arnold's wife managed to take in everybody else too, including Washington. I suspect it's probably easier for a pretty woman to do that than a guy like Benedict Arnold. But I don't have an answer for you, Roger. I don't know. I don't know.
As long as I'm unmuted, I have another question. It's curious that we have all these politicians that are Harvard and Yale and Princeton grads. Not a lot of these officers were educated, highly educated. Well, I want to say educated in the major universities. I find that interesting.
There weren't that many major universities around to begin with. You're right. And my number is, I can't remember exactly what the number is, but only 17 or so went to college or attended college, graduated from college. So not that many colleges around to begin with. But the politicians tended to be, you're right, I think more of the college graduates than and I always am amazed by the politicians of this period thinking that when we formed the new nation and had the Constitution in place, that we wouldn't have professional politicians. They would have people come in and serve their country, then leave after a short period of time, when in fact, all of these guys were professional politicians: Jefferson, Adams, Madison, et cetera, et cetera. So I find that it's kind of an interesting irony that they viewed it one way and actually operated another way. But I don't think that the whole college education thing was a particularly important thing to Washington's generals.
Bill, I have a question about Knox.
Surely.
In your list of occupations, I did not see bookseller, but I thought he was one.
I have to go back and take a look at that. Let me see if I can.
But maybe he was classed as a gentleman.
Now,
I would have said bookseller, but maybe I have him under merchant. I have to admit that I put that chart together probably about 10 years ago. So I can't remember off the top of my head, but merchant would have qualified as bookseller. So yeah, I think he's under merchant.
Oh, yeah, surely. Yeah. Hey, I've got a question for you, Bill. You listed Mifflin as one of the worst generals. I was wondering
Yes.
why.
Basically because of his involvement as quartermaster general and his failure to carry through in all those, and then partially because of his probable involvement in the Conway cabal. I thought those two things, and that was a fun thing with the list because, nobody, with the possible exception of Benedict Arnold, could have just automatically been put on the worst list. There were a couple that you had to look, they did some good things, they did some bad things. I like the argument. People say, well, how about Anthony Wayne? Yeah, that's another good choice. There were a number of other people who could have made either list in my accounting, but these were my views. And I always hope that in a post-talk discussion that people come up and say, oh, no, you're wrong. He should never have been on that list. This is the guy you should have on the list. And I always say to people, if you're going to argue that, tell me who you want to drop off the list to replace him with your candidate. And it makes for a fun discussion.
How about some other questions out there? If you want to ask, just
Ask away.
Which general was the gunsmith?
One of the ones in Pomeroy, I believe. I'm from Massachusetts, who turned down his commission. I'm pretty sure that was the one.
Thank you.
Seth Pomeroy.
I'm a gun collector.
Okay. I'd have to double check that, but as I said, I put this presentation together about 15 years ago, and I always manage to insult somebody's favorite character or ancestor, or say something nice about somebody else's, so it kind of balances out. I had somebody come up to me at one point and thank me for mentioning Daniel Hitchcock as a possible candidate for a generalship, who, had he not died in January of 1777, and this fellow was an ancestor of Hitchcock, and he said nobody ever says anything good about him. So I made a friend that night, but I insulted somebody else's ancestor. So
Thank you.
Speaking of insults, Peter Muhlenberg was actually an Anglican minister in Western Virginia. His father, of course, was the famous Lutheran.
Right.
But when Peter wanted to be ordained, he had to go back to Heidelberg, like all Lutherans at that time, before the diocese was established. And while he was there, he chose to sow his oats rather than concentrate on his education. He ended up joining a dragoon regiment and fighting a duel with the mayor, and got in a whole lot of trouble. So Melchior Muhlenberg, his father, had to pull strings, and they smuggled him out of Heidelberg and brought him back to the States. But the Lutherans after that wouldn't have anything to do with him. And that's why he became an Anglican minister and moved to Virginia.
That's another good thing that happens in this talk. Somebody always has a new piece of information that I wasn't aware of. So I thank you very much for that. And I do appreciate learning that. I've always read that he was a Lutheran minister in the Valley.
He's buried it with his right next to his father in Trapp, Pennsylvania.
Right. I've seen that. Yeah.
And he has one great quote. I think it was the Byrds who ran Hopewell Furnace at the end of the war, because Byrd had run up a huge debt as a person who was procuring supplies, etc., for the army. He wrote to Muhlenberg, who was then a senator from Pennsylvania, asking him if they could see the Congress's way to sending him a few £1,000 sterling just so he could save the furnace. And Muhlenberg responded that Congress was too busy incurring new debts than to pay attention to old.
Was that Peter Muhlenberg, or was it one of his brothers who was the representative? Was he the Speaker of the House?
I think they both were. I think they both were, maybe not at the same time.
Okay. I knew the brother. Yeah. But these guys they were interesting guys. I mean, they were political, they were ambitious, they were sensitive, they were self-serving. But as I said, they were dedicated, they were loyal, they were courageous. So they're in really a bundle of contradictions in many ways. But they're a fun group to look at, and to every time I pick up a new piece of information or a quote from somewhere, I either try to include it or drop something else out and put it in. So another totally useless piece of minutia for you. The most popular first name of the generals was John. There were 12 Johns, and there were 8 Williams was the second most popular name. And there's a totally useless piece of information for a cocktail party somewhere.
Hey, we've got 3 questions from Lee Bishop. Lee, would you like to unmute and ask those, or shall I ask them from your chat?
Hello. I'd like
Lee,
to bring
go
up
ahead.
John Henchek here. I'd like to bring up a consideration, a candidate that I think was very important in a non-political. I beg your pardon?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
Robert Erskine.
Robert Erskine was not a general in the sense
No,
that
not as a gentleman, but as a person who contributed greatly to the American Revolution, to the point that Washington was concerned enough to ask him to please leave where he was and bring his family into his compound area so he could protect them, seeing the value of this gentleman, who, among other things, is also credited with the Chevaux de Frise.
there's no question he was a valuable and important
Bill just froze up there.
list of the most important military people in the war and expand it from just the generals. That would be fine. But my focus, my look was at these guys. And people say, well, how about Christopher Ludwig, the Baker general? Or how about, there's all kinds of other people who had the title general who were not military brigadier generals, major generals appointed by the Continental Congress. So yeah, no argument with Erskine, certainly, but he wasn't one of the men who I was considering in my presentation. So
May I comment on that gentleman's question?
sure.
Wasn't it at Pluckerman Artillery Camp where Washington wanted Erskine to come and be protected in Middlebrook?
John, can you answer that?
I was considering, I misunderstood first the question. Just generally speaking, there are people who made contributions to the revolution, and that's where I was going with this.
Yeah.
I knew very obviously you're talking about the generals, and I knew that Erskine did not have a rank. You might be correct on that, Linda. I'm not sure. It's not an area of my interest. I only brought up Erskine because if I look at people who've made contributions, we can go to the here in Lambertville, New Hope, we have a situation that occurred by a person who was the quartermaster in the Pennsylvania side. And as Washington moved his troops to New Hope, Coriolis Ferry, New Hope to Coriolis Ferry, Lambertville, they had no food. And the man supplied, and he was a cripple, 5 days worth of feed for the horses. But earlier on, it was very clear that they didn't have anything at all. And this is one of those cases which are documented, that he supplied the whole of the army with 5 days worth of feed for the horses. And without that, they weren't going to go any further to the Battle of Monmouth. And there's some other notes that I normally carry. I didn't think I'd be discussing him, but been trying to get people here in New Hope, particularly to recognize the contribution of someone who was dropped on his head as a kid, broke his neck and was interned, and forever could only have motion with crutches. And he made such a wonderful contribution. And he then at the end of the war resigned his commission. So it's one of those things that I like to get people in this area to understand the importance of the contributors to the revolution and that contribution, which ultimately led to where we are today. That's it.
Hey, I'd like to ask these questions for Lee Bishop, who did not unmute, but so she had 3 questions in the chat. One was, how did Nathaniel Greene become a general when he had been only a private in the Kentish Guards? That's the first one.
Very interesting question, and there doesn't appear to be a lot of information about that. I've looked to try to find more, but essentially his family was pretty influential in Rhode Island, and the Rhode Island legislature, when they put together their units for Boston, for the Army of Observation up there, they appointed Greene the brigadier general. I mean, immediately he was promoted from private to brigadier general, and I can't find much about how that happened, but except to say it was probably some insider information, as I mentioned earlier, and insider influence, particularly by his rather wealthy Quaker family. So that's the best I can do on that. I've been unable to find anything more about that.
It was a good decision.
Yep.
Delaware and Maryland troops were very active, especially in the Southern campaign, she says, and I know these troops were not that numerous. Is that why there weren't many generals from those 2 states, Delaware and Maryland?
Certainly with Delaware, there was a move later in the war that really never came to pass, that kind of was going to override all the pieces necessary to be promoted, and essentially say somebody like a John Haslett, had he lived, could have been probably promoted to general, like almost like a favorite son kind of a thing. But Haslett was dead at that point. Delaware essentially contributed 1 regiment in various iterations. It kind of was reorganized a couple times. And again, the Baltimore resolutions supposedly said that you can only have as many generals to command units as the units you provided. The major generals were far more confusing because that didn't work out that way. Connecticut had 4 major generals and certainly didn't, I think it had 8 regiments at one point at most. But the Maryland probably had about the right number, because they essentially had about a division worth of troops, and they had 2 brigadier generals and 1 major general. So that made good sense right there. New Jersey, probably a little more than they needed, because they really only supplied about 4 regiments. But again, you have to realize that this is over the course of 8 years, so people are coming and going. There were never 78 generals present at one time during the war. I think the highest might have been in the 30s. And it was a question of who was available, who had the influence to be promoted, who had some experience and a decent record to be promoted. I've read that Washington was not a big fan of promoting, and this is way before the Cowpens, but not a big fan of promoting Daniel Morgan to general. It was Horatio Gates who was more instrumental in getting him promoted. And so, you know, it really varies. I'm not sure some of these things are answerable questions. And I've read the biographies, I've read the journals of the Continental Congress, I've read Washington's papers. So
another question for you, though, is why didn't Greene get along with Congress? Was he really that much of a straight speaker? Or
I guess, and part of it, the Congress, I don't think the Congress liked to be questioned. They got particularly upset when generals started saying to him, hey, you know, you can't be doing this, you should be doing this. Part of it, John Adams and Nathaniel Greene had a pretty good relationship early on, but when de Caudray was coming on the scene, and there was rumors that he was going to be the Major General commanding artillery and engineers, Sullivan, Greene, and Knox all wrote to the Continental Congress saying, no, this can't be, and we're going to resign. And that really kind of put the kibosh on the relationship with Greene and Adams. And they didn't communicate for quite a while after that. And then I think maybe later they started to again, but it was really, I think, because of the generals, they really viewed each other in almost a hostile way to some degree, because of the nature of, I guess, the Congress not wanting to be militaristic or not wanting to have the whole standing army thing, Washington using regular troops versus militia troops. I mean, that was certainly a big issue. Even Charles Lee, to a degree, wanted to use militia more than regular troops. best answer I can give you, I guess.
We have a question from Bob Wong in the chat, but I see he's got his hand raised. Bob, did you just want to ask your question verbally?
Yeah, sure. One of the things that's intrigued me for quite some time is after Fort Washington fell, Washington did not sack or depose Nathaniel Greene. So the question, this is early in the war, 1776. So the question is, what did Greene show other than Trenton? Well, maybe that's the answer, that allowed him to stay in Washington's favor.
Well, I would say one thing was loyalty. I would also say that it goes back to somebody else, and I'm not sure whose question it was. Maybe it was Roger's question in terms of how did Washington pick these guys? How did he determine who should be his inner circle? And again, I'm not sure we can ever answer that question, but he saw something in Greene that he, I guess he was impressed with, whether it was a calm, cool nature or loyalty or good advice to him, whatever. Same with Knox. I mean, look at Germantown. You could argue that without the stop off at the Clifton Mansion in Germantown, the battle might have gone in a different direction, and Washington should never have taken Knox's views there, which I agree he shouldn't have. Bob, you ask great questions, and I wish I had great answers for you, but that's the best I can do. I mean, you go to any manager today and say, how does a manager find people who are good people to work for them? I think a lot of it is intuitiveness as opposed to anything else. But Greene didn't do, I don't think Greene did anything especially significant at Trenton. Led his troops, Washington was there, Princeton maybe more so. That best I can do, Bob.
Okay, thank you.
So we've got a question from Steve Rawling and also one from Claudia. Steve, did you want to ask your question verbally? Can unmute. If not, then I can ask it for him. He asked, to what extent did Washington's headquarters function more as a minor royal court as opposed to a professional military headquarters? For example, he says, was there any sort of training on how to be a successful quartermaster for the guy who was picked after Greene was sent south?
Good Lord, never heard anything like that at all. Gary Eckelbarger and I had just have been having discussions about Washington's headquarters, and he talked about Washington's headquarters at Valley Forge with the house, and I argue that the whole area was a headquarters complex. But boy, that's a wonderful question. The answer that I'm aware of is no. There was never any kind of training that I've ever read about. Probably a lot of this was on the job training as you go, as you learn. I don't know how much Greene might have passed along to some of his subordinates who passed along to who was the quartermaster after Greene? Was it Pickering? Was it Pickering at that point, or was he adjutant?
Pickering took over.
Pickering. Okay.
Yeah, he was quartermaster for the rest of the war.
I don't think anybody could have told Pickering anything. I think he knew it all pretty much, in my opinion. Another irascible character, but no, I've never heard of anything that there was any kind of training. I think they just were thrown into the jobs and learned on the job. Anybody have a different view on that? Anybody have any information? I'd love to hear it.
Got a question.
These are great questions. Usually I get questions like, who was the gunsmith, which was a great question, by the way. And I did check it with Seth Pomeroy. So, but those are the questions I like because they're easy to answer.
Claudia, you've got a question.
Okay, actually, it's Tom.
Actually, I'm Claudia's husband, Tom. Washington earlier in his life fought for the British, like during the 7-Year War. I was just wondering if any of the other generals earlier in their life also fought for the British.
Yes, there were actually 1 to 7: Charles Lee, Richard Montgomery, Horatio Gates, Arthur Sinclair, William Maxwell, Edward Hand, and William Irwin, as well as Hugh Mercer was in the Jacobite Army. So there were 7 in the British Army and 1 against the British Army. Yep. And again, Washington, Richard Montgomery was killed pretty early on. Washington was not a big fan of Lee, probably. Gates, same thing. Sinclair, after Ticonderoga, Sinclair never got another major command. He showed up at Yorktown, but really did not have any kind of a role there. William Maxwell was eventually resigned. His Jersey officers complained about him. Edward Hand was out at Fort Pitt for quite a while, came back, commanded a brigade, as did William Irwin. So yes, it was seven were British officers and one was a Jacobite officer.
And John Armstrong certainly served during the French and Indian War from Pennsylvania. But
A lot of them, Bob, a lot of these officers served, but the question is who served for the British Army specifically,
oh, okay.
who were British officers.
Did you say Edward Hand? Because he certainly, I think he was 23rd foot.
Yeah, I did mention Edward Hand.
Okay.
Bob,
Charles Lee, Richard Montgomery, Horatio Gates, Arthur Sinclair, William Maxwell, Edward Hand, William Irwin, and then Hugh Mercer, the Jacobite.
Bob, I have a question and a comment.
Yeah.
When Pulaski resigned his commission as commander of horse, Stephen Moylan thought he was going to be made a brigadier and take over. But for the remainder of the war, the 4 regiments of dragoons, which was the mounted arm, never had a brigadier. Any reason why Washington didn't want to put someone overall command of the mounted troops?
He did want to put Joseph Reed, and Reed turned down his commission. He wanted Reed to be the cavalry commander. He turned down his commission. Part of the reason might have been there really wasn't much of a cavalry presence in the Army. The cavalry, the dragoons, were expensive to run. They needed horses and a lot of equipment and supplies that were not available that readily to the Army. Plus the fact that they also kind of moved to a legion kind of situation with Lee's Legion and then Pulaski's Legion and Armand's Legion and that kind of, and then the cavalry, what cavalry existed kind of merged and went south. I think the 1st and the 3rd Dragoons were together in the Southern campaigns. 2nd Dragoons, I think, spent most of the time in the Highlands. Moylan, I think, was with the Army. Maybe there wasn't a need. I don't know. I know Washington wanted Reed to, and maybe Cadwalader. I'd have to check that. Maybe Cadwalader, he wanted to take over the cavalry too. But they both turned down their commissions.
At the end of 77, though, I thought he appointed Pulaski as a cavalry
He did.
commander over all 4 regiments. No,
He
That
did,
was-
but that, as the gentleman was saying, it didn't last that long.
Yeah, when he resigned in February of 78, he was only the
Right.
commander for 6 months or so.
Yeah.
Hey,
And
Bill,
then after Moylan, him and Moylan never got along, and Moylan thought he was going to get the brigadier. And it, like you just said, the cavalry was just so small that they didn't need it, didn't make a brigade.
Yeah, and they were never together in that sense. They were spread out. So there probably wasn't a need for an officer, to
yeah,
command.
they
as
didn't
such.
really need a unified command. They had a different function. Hey,
Mhm.
Mike Balmer asks, Bill, if you would put up your list of the 10 worst generals again. That's a popular one. There you go.
Here's my 10 worst. And
Just
get-
throw 'em away.
Israel Putnam is on there not because he really did, anything particularly bad, but rather he didn't do anything particularly good that everybody expected he was going to do. He was not the hero, the star that I think initially they expected he was going to be. So he kind of gets on my list for that.
I see a lot of these guys are men who crossed Washington.
Yeah. Adam Stephen isn't on there. Maybe he should be. I'm not sure. Adam Stephen of Washington had a contentious relationship going back to the French and Indian War and running for the House of Burgesses.
Probably would be one that I would have added to this list.
Adam Stephen.
Yeah.
But when I came up with this list, I come up with some really big mistakes like Benedict Arnold, or some that were more extensive as opposed to Stephen, who really only blew it at Germantown. And there's also some argument that he really wasn't as guilty as everybody suggested, but that he, as some of you said, he crossed Washington, and that was more of a historic crossing and Washington's effort to get rid of him than anything else. That somebody needs to really look at that and do some research and do some writing on that, because that's an interesting story.
There we go. Just let you know what some of our upcoming topics are. We heard Bill earlier mention Benjamin Rush as number one complainer of the revolution.
That's my view.
And if you wanted to hear more about that complainer, who was actually a pretty interesting and very radical leader during the
Yes.
revolution, we're going to have Steve Yasik in March talk with us about Dr. Benjamin Rush. In June, we're going to have John Fabiano talk with us about the British Army's march to Monmouth. And Bill, you mentioned Gary Eckelbarger, who is right now working on a series of, I think, 3 books about
Right.
Washington during his campaigns during the Revolution.
Yep.
And I believe he's going to be able to talk with us in December. So those are some things we have coming up. I wanted to,
Gary just shared the cover of his volume 1 coming up, and it is beautiful. It is maybe the neatest looking cover of a revolutionary book that I've seen in a long time. It's
Great.
look forward to this. Gary really has done a great job on some of this stuff.
outstanding. I just would like to say thank you once again to the Swan Historical Foundation for supporting the Washington Crossing American Revolution Roundtable, and our thanks to Bill for an excellent presentation, and thanks to all of you for participating tonight.